Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Good Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Right, I hope you can see me over all these bottles here. I'm a bit caged in here, it would appear. Anyway, basically due to the EU referendum, I won't sort of beat around the bush, and the rather seismic changes that's going to bring upon us, I thought, time for a change in the Good Dram Show. Well, not particularly seismic, but time to look at some beer, you know. Yeah, I haven't done a beer episode of the show for quite a considerable time. I think I've only done one before. In actual fact, that was the Harvestoonie one that I did. I think it was around about Christmas time some years ago. I forget now, but anyway. So why am I doing beer? Well, why not? The beers we're looking at today come from the St Peter's Brewery in South Elmham in Suffolk, which is down my neck of the woods. I mean, coming from Norfolk, so I knew the brewery. I knew their beer, and they got in contact with us and said, "Yeah, are you interested in looking at our range?" I thought, well, yeah, why not? And I didn't think their range was as big as what it actually is. When they sent me the information, it's like, you know, a dozen or so different bottled beers, specials, and all this kind of stuff. And then they said, so I said, well, do you mind sending me some samples? Of course, no problem, you know. So here I am. I picked half a dozen from their range, and I'm going to taste them today. Now, the interesting thing about obviously doing beer tasting is the fact that I've not tasted them prior to actually doing an episode of the show. Unlike most of the whiskies, or practically all the whiskies that I use on the show, I've pre-tasted, so you know I can make a selection. It's not necessarily I know exactly what I'm tasting, because you know different they can often sort of show different characteristics depending upon your mood and the warmth, etc., etc. Anyway. But obviously with the beer, I've just cracked them open now, and so this is all completely and utterly blind. And like I said, I had no idea that they have such a huge range. So the brewery itself, like I said, is in a little town called South Elmham, which is near Bungay in Suffolk. If you know Suffolk, you'll probably know the area. The brewery itself was built in 1996, so it's been around for 20 odd years now, in a range of traditional former agricultural buildings, and quite a pretty looking brewery it is indeed, it has to be said. So that's pretty much about it. I mean, like I said, they seem to, I've seen them about in a number of different places, but you know, there's millions of breweries now. I was reading the other day in Nottingham, I think there's something like about 20 odd breweries in the city, and if you take the sort of Nottinghamshire as a whole, there's probably about 50, and so if you just multiply that by the number of counties there are in the UK, I'll tell you how many breweries there are knocking around, and it's certainly a growth industry. But anyway, that's enough about that. Let's introduce this afternoon's little lineup, and I'll talk through the individual styles of the beers as we introduce them. So, right, I'll just introduce them. Right, okay, so today we're going to kick off with the organic Best Bitter. Now, this is apparently created with venture barley, along with Target Sovereign and First Gold hops. Like I said, all are organic. Now, bitter is, you know, just a classic kind of terminology for you know, English beer, really, I suppose. It's generally made with pale malts, and often has, you know, quite a fairly hoppy kind of character. It was kind of designed, I suppose, to, for want of a better word, to bring something different to the table, as opposed to when mild was very much the in style of beer, and just have something with a little bit more bitterness and hoppiness. So that's the organic best. Then we're going to be looking at the organic ale. The best, by the way, is 4.1%. The ale is 4.5. Again, the ale is very similar, made from very similar ingredients. They use venture barley, but they use, and First Gold hops, but they also use Marikana hops, and I believe the the brewery has developed their own single strain of organic yeast to make the beer with. Now, ale generally tends to be slightly more maltier, fuller bodied than a bitter, interesting enough, the originator of ale, the old ale, had quite a sort of acidic character, and was often aged in casks to sort of like develop that character and add some oxidation notes. So current ale is quite a different kettle of fish to the old ale, so be interesting to see what that's like. The third beer we'll be looking at is this one. It's called the Saints Whisky Beer, and again it's essentially the ale, but they use a generous measure apparently of peated English whiskey from the St George's distillery just up the road in Norfolk, so that should be quite interesting. Then we're going to look at the mild. The mild is mild, as the terminology suggests. It was generally lower in alcohol than bitters and ales, and this is indeed the case with this being at 3.7%, and was a very traditional, but not very often seen these days. It was pretty much, mild was the beer, until bitter came along, and ale the mild seemed to sort of fall out of character, so or popularity, I should say, which is a shame, because and it's nice to see the resurgence of breweries that are producing a mild, because it is a really interesting style of beer, it has to be said. The fifth beer we're going to be looking at is this one. It is the old style porter at 5.1%. Now, apparently porter was very, very popular in the 1700s, certainly with the manual workers, and hence the term porter. Old style porter was actually a blend made up of 3 different types of beer. An old ale, which could have been either sort of soured or stale, a new ale, which is rather obvious, which could be either brown or pale, and a mild ale, and all 3 were combined in whatever the differing amounts that the brewery wanted to use. And these days it's not. These days it's actually made as a beer in itself, and tends to be made from a base of pale malts and black malt, crystal, chocolate or smoked brown malt, which basically gives it the sort of the darker colour and the sort of like slightly more roasted characteristics of the beer. And finally we'll be looking at this one, which is the Cream Stout. Now stout, very popular. I love stout, and again made from sort of roasted unmalted barley, which is pretty much killed to the point of blackness really, which is what gives it its colour, and again sort of like a heavier roasted flavour. Now Cream Stout is essentially a milk stout, which I believe was developed in the late 19th century with the use, I think it was kind of, from what I've read, it was sort of seen almost more as a kind of food stuff, and so that by the use of lactose and whey is what gave it its kind of creamy nature. It also gave it more protein and all that kind of stuff, but whether that of course is true or not is open to debate. But basically a cream stout is a sweeter stout, and so the lactose and the whey are kind of like sort of balancing up against the sort of like the bitterness of the hops that and the roasted barley character. So it should be interesting. And like I said, I've not tasted any of these before, so it's going to be as new for you as it is for me. So let's kick off with the organic best then, shall we? Right, okay, let's see what the nose good is. classic bitter. It's got a slight sourness. Like it's got that sort of slight sort of been left in the to slightly oxidised kind of character as well, which it may well have done so. I don't think this is barrel aged or but it's just got that kind of classic beer character, you know, that lovely classic beer character. Quite malty, with some restrained use of hops. It's not particularly floral. It's quite elegant. Yeah, that's a nice beer. Palate. Really nicely balanced. Got that lovely bitterness that you would expect, but sort of the malt is giving it a really lovely, soft, full flavour. Lovely, lovely length. Really intense, but still very almost delicate and elegant, to be honest with you. And it's certainly not sort of whacking you in the face with its bitterness. It has to be said. It's all nicely harmonious. Really, really quite enjoyable. So yeah, that's good. Okay, so let's move on to the ale. Let's see what the nose gives us on that then, shall we? Lighter, less hoppy, as you would expect. It's quite fruity in actual fact. It's got a sort of slightly sort of apricot-y kind of character, a little bit of straw. Subtly malty, very pale, you know, it's quite a nice refreshing kind of nose, I think. Palate. Again, not as hoppy as the bitter, nowhere near as bitter. There's a little bit of bitterness, but not very much at all. It's very soft, it's easy going, it's very much what you'd call a sort of session beer, I suppose. Slightly floral, again, some pleasant fruit, apricot, almost kind of slightly honeyed kind of character to it. Good length, and yeah, nice twang on the finish, it has to be said. So so yeah, that's again really very, very enjoyable. Right, let's move on to the whiskey ale then. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? I can smell the whiskey straight off the bat. It's got that slightly smoky, rich barley kind of character, which is kind of almost sort of overlaying the subtle ale kind of character. It's a little bit of straw. Not quite as fruity as the organic ale. Obviously the slight smokiness and the whiskey is kind of just taking that sort of edge off, but that's really interesting, really nice. Well, bit softer in the mouth in actual fact, a bit creamier. Obvious whiskey character kind of coming through, a slight sort of peatiness, light smokiness. Again, quite malty, elegant, delicate. But again, you know, a really kind of pleasant sort of session beer though. At sort of 4.8, that's probably getting a little bit up the ABV for a sort of like a real session ale, but bit of a not honeyed kind of finish, but a bit of a sweetness on the finish, which is quite pleasant. But nice. Right, okay, so let's move on to the mild. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Mild, soft, really very, very chocolatey in actual fact. Not bitter dark chocolate, more milky kind of chocolate. Soft. There's a little bit of roasted malt note, but again it's the sort of soft, sweet character that's kind of coming through, the sweet chocolatey character. Palate? That's lovely. It's light. It's not as heavy as a stout or a porter, but it's got a nice subtle roasted character, chocolate, almost kind of red berry kind of fruit character, which is quite unusual. A little bit of citrus. All just really, really nicely balanced. Again, it's another sort of easy to drink beer. It's sort of like, you know, 3.7%, and it's just all round really quite pleasant. Very soft, like I said, chocolatey. Yeah, really enjoyable that. And moving on to the porter. Let's see what the nose gives us on this. More earthy, a little bit of chocolate, coffee, both dark and milk chocolate notes I'm getting coming through here. Some lovely subtle roasted malt notes. That's dark. That's really, really impressive. But again, it's not sort of like huge and OTT. I've tasted some porters and stouts that are, you know, you stick your nose in and all you get is just a face full of coffee, and yeah, alright, you can say that's really impressive for its intensity, but sometimes they just lack a little bit of complexity, and you know, can come across slightly one-dimensional, but this certainly doesn't do that at all. It's got some lovely, like I said, sort of combination of sort of bitter dark chocolate and milk chocolate along with a little bit of coffee. Palate? Again, lovely balance, a really nice balance between the darker bitter chocolate and the sort of softer, maltier, sweeter components. Yeah, that's a really nice mouthful. Lovely sort of roasted character, coffee, as you would expect from a porter, but just not quite as heavy. It's got a sort of like a lightness to it, but it's got sort of like enough robust depth to it to make it sort of, you know, really interesting. I mean, and like I said, I mean, I've tasted a number of porters that can be a little bit weak and wishy-washy, or they can just be too OTT on, you know, the whole coffee character. But this, I just think, is just really nicely balanced. This is good. And finally, we're on to the Cream Stag. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Quite a subtle nose. I mean, it is subtly creamy. Again, sort of like dark chocolate, coffee, roasted malt. And I mean, I was probably expecting it to be more creamier than what it actually is, and it's very, very subtle on the creaminess. But it just again takes that sort of slight edge off the slightly more bittery sort of stout character. Palate? not as big as I was expecting. Actually, again, like I said, I think I was expecting it to be more creamy and sort of softer, but it's all just really nicely balanced. There is a creaminess and a softness which kind of does offset the sort of the darker roasted bitter notes. Again, quite chocolatey, coffeed. Does finish a little bit on the sweet side, it has to be said, but all told, I think that's really nicely balanced. So, getting quite a nice bitter aftertaste now. It's just a case of waiting a few moments for the bitterness to suddenly sort of kick in. Yeah, that's really complex. That's really interesting. I like that. That's good. Okay, so let's sum this week's episode of the show up then, shall we? The St Peter's Brewery in Suffolk. Well, I think they're creating some very nice beers. When you think about it, they've been doing it for long enough, so they should be able to do so. I think the whole range, certainly that I've tasted, are really interesting and definitely worth sort of like tracking down if you get the opportunity to do so. And it's just really interesting to look at all these sort of different styles. And what I think I liked most about them was the subtlety and the elegance and delicacy to a certain extent. You know, they're not going to hit you in the face with sort of like huge amount of hops and huge amount of coffeed malt and all that kind of stuff. They're relatively restrained, you know, and just nicely complex. You know, they're not one-dimensional. They've got a lot of different characters to each of the particular beers, and you know, depending upon which sort of style is your preferred choice, then I think they kind of make a beer for every palate, shall we say? Which, well, there you go. You can't say fairer than that, can you? So anyway, that's this week's episode of this show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've now got lots of beer to go finish and watch a football match, I think, probably. So anyway, all I can say is good afternoon.